Managers of Reddit, what led you to fire an employee on their very first day? Story 1. I had an employee show up on their first day completely unprepared for the job. Now, we had clearly communicated in the interview process what the job entailed, including the skills and tools they'd need to be proficient in. So I was expecting someone who was ready to at least learn the ropes. Instead, this person came in with no understanding of the basics, which was fine if they had at least showed some willingness to ask questions. But nope. The first red flag came when they spent over 30 minutes in the break room getting to know the office while their team members were busy working. When I went over to check on them, I could tell they weren't focused. When I asked what they were doing, they said they were thinking of ideas, but it was clear they hadn't even begun to grasp what we did or how we operated. I gave them a task to complete, just a simple document review, and they stared at it for over an hour without even attempting to start. After I suggested they ask someone for help if they were stuck, they told me, "I think I'll just figure it out myself." I let them go by the end of the day. Some people might need time to adjust, but this person wasn't putting in the effort. And that, unfortunately, was a red flag I couldn't ignore. Story 2. I was the manager at a small marketing, and we had a new hire start one Monday. They seemed promising in interviews, but I quickly realized that their personality didn't mesh with our company culture. The first sign of trouble came when they joined a team meeting, and instead of listening and taking notes like we expected, they started arguing with everyone about our processes and suggestions for the projects. It wasn't constructive, just very combative. They were also not respecting the deadlines, and when I checked in with them, they kept making excuses. But the real kicker came when they shared their opinion about the clients. They openly criticized them, calling some old-fashioned and outdated, which is the opposite of what we encourage. We rely heavily on client trust, and that sort of attitude was a huge liability. I told them we weren't a good fit and they left after lunch. It was unfortunate, but it was clear from that first day that they weren't going to adapt to our work environment. Story 3. It was a startup atmosphere and we were all hands on deck. When this new employee came in, they were very confident during the interview, mentioning all kinds of technical skills and their ability to pick up anything quickly. However, once they actually started, it became obvious that they had been overselling their experience. During a team coding session, they made several blunders. Basic things like not using version control correct, causing issues that interrupted the team's workflow. When I asked them why they hadn't followed standard protocol, their response was that they didn't think it was necessary and didn't like working by the book. I asked them to do a simple task the next day, just a basic setup for a project we were starting. They emailed me at 11 a.m. to tell me they hadn't even started because they had forgotten the instructions. At that point, I knew this person wouldn't last. By the end of the day, I told them it just wasn't going to work out. When they asked for feedback, I said, "You can't ignore the fundamentals and expect to succeed here." Story 4. I never thought I'd be firing someone on their first day, but it happened. We hired someone for a customer support role, and on their first shift, I could tell they weren't really interested in the work. They spent most of their time on their phone, scrolling through social media during training. I gave them some space to get up to speed, but I was checking in every hour, and each time I did, they seemed distracted or disengaged. When they finally took a call, they answered in the most disinterested tone. I could hear the lack of energy over the phone, and the customer on the other end was clearly frustrated. After that call, I took them aside and asked how they were feeling. They shrugged and said they weren't feeling it. I told them that if they weren't fully invested in the role, then they wouldn't be able to do their best work, and we needed people who were eager to learn and help. They left within an hour. I was shocked, but I'm glad I didn't wait any longer. Story 5. It was a small retail store, and we had just hired a new sales associate. They had the right look, the right attitude in the interview, and I thought they'd fit right in with the rest of the team. However, from the moment they walked in on their first day, I knew something was off. They didn't want to follow our uniform policy, claiming it was too rigid, and that they'd be more comfortable in their own clothes. Then, they refused to learn the store's point-of-sale system, saying they didn't need instructions and that they figured it out faster by trial and error. When I offered to show them the ropes, they rolled their eyes and insisted they were fine. Things came to a head when a customer asked for help, and instead of assisting, they told the customer to find it themselves, because it's probably over there somewhere. That was it for me. I called them into the back and let them know they were being let go. It's one thing to be confident, but it's another to be arrogant to the point where you can't even respect the basic structure of the workplace. Story 6. This happened at a digital agency I was managing. We hired a new designer, and I was looking forward to getting them on. They seemed talented in the interview, with a strong portfolio. On the first day, they arrived a little late, which I didn't think too much about. However, what concerned me was their approach to teamwork. As soon as I introduced them to the other designers, they gave off this "I'm too good for this" vibe. They barely spoke to anyone, and when they did, it was often to offer unsolicited advice on how things should be done. They immediately jumped into working on a project that required collaboration with our developers. As we discussed a few basic features and design elements, the new hire started arguing about why the developers should adjust to their vision. They insisted on using certain tools that didn't integrate well with our system, and then became visibly frustrated when the developers didn't jump on board with the idea. After a couple of hours of tension, I sat them down and suggested they try to be more open to the collaborative nature of the job. Their response was, "I don't need to adapt to anyone's style. I know my craft." That's when I knew we couldn't work together. Design is a team effort, and someone who couldn't even begin to listen to their colleagues was not a good fit. I had to let them go by the afternoon. Story 7. I work as a shift manager at a busy restaurant, and we had a new hire start for a front-of-house position. They seemed super excited when they walked in and immediately asked questions about the schedule, the menu, and the tip system. I thought, this person is going to be great. The first few hours seemed fine. They took notes during training and were picking up the steps relatively quick. Then things went downhill. We had a rush that day, and the new hire seemed to freeze up when the orders started piling in. I tried to help, but every time I offered advice, they'd snap back with comments like, "I know what I'm doing," and "I don't need your help." At first, I brushed it off as nerves, but when they started making mistakes, like mixing up the orders and getting visibly frustrated with customers, I knew it wasn't just nerves. When a customer asked for a modification on a dish, the new hire rolled their eyes and said, "Why do people have to complicate things?" That did it. I told them that we needed someone who could handle pressure and be respectful of both customers and the team. They didn't respond well to that feedback, and by the end of their shift, they had decided to leave on their own. It was a shame, but we couldn't afford someone who wasn't ready to adapt and respect the job. Story 8. I've been managing a tech startup for a few years, and when we hired a new junior developer, I was excited about what they could bring to the team. The first day, they came in with all the right credentials, looking sharp and ready to dive in. The problem started during the onboarding process. We have a fairly comprehensive onboarding system where new hires are paired with a mentor to help them learn the ropes. This new developer, though, immediately insisted that they didn't need any help and that they were already familiar with most of the tools we use. They claimed to have experience with the framework we used, so I let them get started on a small bug fix task to see how they would approach things. About an hour later, I checked in with them and saw that they hadn't even touched the code. They were scrolling through Stack Overflow and watching YouTube videos on unrelated topics. I asked if they needed help, and they said, "I'm just looking up the best way to do it," which seemed fine, but they never actually attempted to solve the problem themselves. When I asked for a progress update by the end of the day, they told me that they were still figuring things out. That was a clear sign that they either didn't know how to work independently or weren't motivated enough to even try. I couldn't keep someone on the team who didn't put in the effort, so I let them go by the end of the shift. Story 9. I had one of the most bizarre experiences with a new hire on their first day. They were hired for an administrative assistant position, and I thought they would be a great addition to our team. Everything seemed fine during the interview. They were enthusiastic and had the required skills. But things took a strange turn when they arrived for their first shift. They came in wearing an outfit that was completely inappropriate for the office, like something you would wear to a casual weekend BBQ, not an office environment. It wasn't just the attire, it was the whole vibe. They seemed extremely disorganized and couldn't remember basic instructions about where to find documents or how to use the office tools. I chalked it up to first day jitters, but as the day wore on, it became clear that they didn't seem to care much about the job. The real turning point came when they were asked to handle a phone call with a client. The new hire barely spoke to the client, kept interrupting them, and even laughed awkwardly during a serious conversation. When I asked them about it afterward, they casually said, "I didn't think it was that important." I couldn't believe it. Client interactions were a huge part of the job, and their casual approach was simply unacceptable. I let them go before the day ended, and it was clear they had little regard for professionalism. Story 10. I was managing a small logistics company, and we hired a warehouse worker to help with the daily operations. They were recommended by a friend of mine who vouched for their work ethic, but on the first day, that quickly fell apart. They showed up on time, and everything seemed okay until they started their first task. The task was simple: unload a truck of inventory and sort it into categories. However, this new hire seemed to have no interest in following instructions. They would randomly start stacking boxes in the wrong sections without even checking the labels. When I pointed it out, they shrugged and said, "It's fine, I know how to organize things." They didn't take it seriously, and every time I asked them to correct their mistakes, they'd roll their eyes and make dismissive comments. Things got worse when I asked them to work with a colleague to move a heavy load. Instead of cooperating, they started complaining about the weight, then loudly told everyone that they weren't getting paid enough for this kind of work. At that point, I knew we had a problem. A person who wasn't willing to do the work or cooperate with others wasn't going to fit in. By the end of the day, I told them it wasn't working out. They left without a word. Story 11. I manage a small boutique marketing agency, and we recently hired a new copywriter. From the interview, they seemed great, energetic, passionate about writing, and had a good grasp of the industry. I expected they'd need a little time to adjust to our specific brand voice, but I had no idea how quickly things would unravel. On their first day, they were assigned to write a blog post for one of our key clients with clear guidelines in place. I set them up with a couple of reference documents, explained the tone and style we used, and left them to it. After a few hours, they handed me the draft. I took one look at it and was floored. It wasn't just that it didn't align with our usual tone. It was completely off base. The language was casual to the point of being unprofessional, filled with slang, and the structure was all over the place. It seemed as though they hadn't even read the brief properly. When I asked them what happened, they claimed, "Well, I thought I could add some personality to it." I explained that we couldn't just add personality without considering the client's expectations and their audience. I suggested a few revisions, but the response was surprising. They got defensive. "I've been writing for years. I know what works," they said. It was clear they weren't open to feedback and that they were unwilling to adjust their approach. I realized by the end of the day that they weren't going to be a fit for the role. It was hard, but I let them go the next morning. Story 12. I've been running a small but very active coffee shop for a few years. We had a new barista start last week, and she seemed promising. She had experience at other cafes and had worked with high-end espresso machines before, so I thought she'd be able to handle the morning rush without much issue. The first day, she came in a bit late, but I didn't think much of it. I introduced her to the team and gave her a brief rundown of our process. Then, the chaos of the morning rush hit. The first sign that things weren't going well was when she looked completely overwhelmed by the orders coming in. It was a busy Saturday, but she should have been prepared for that. Instead of asking for help or staying calm, she started making mistakes. She'd put in the wrong drink orders, serve drinks without checking the labels, and worst of all, when I tried to correct her, she would argue. She'd say things like, "That's not how we did it at my last job," or "This seems like overkill." No one notices the difference. By the time the lunch rush hit, I was getting complaints from customers about their orders. At that point, I had no choice but to sit her down and have a serious conversation. She seemed resistant to feedback, even when I explained that precision and attention to detail were crucial in our environment. She said, "I don't think this job is for me." That was the nail in the coffin. She left halfway through the day, and we never heard from her again. Story 13. As the director of operations at a logistics company, I was hired to help streamline processes and improve efficiency. We recently hired a new operations assistant, a young man fresh out of college. He was enthusiastic and eager to make an impact, so I thought he'd be a good addition to the team. On his first day, we had him shadow one of the senior employees to learn the ropes. Unfortunately, it became clear very quickly that he had no intention of following anyone else's lead. He kept interrupting the person he was shadowing, offering unsolicited advice, and suggesting changes to processes that he hadn't yet learned about. At first, I chalked it up to him being excited and wanting to prove himself. But after a few hours, it was clear that his advice was coming from a place of arrogance, not helpfulness. He also started making mistakes when given simple tasks. For example, he failed to organize shipments correctly, mixing up priority orders with regular ones. When I pointed this out, his response was, "That's how I do it, and it'll work fine." When I asked him to correct it, he just shrugged. After a couple of hours, I pulled him aside and explained that we needed someone who could learn from their colleagues and respect established procedures. I suggested that he try to take things more slowly and absorb the information before jumping in with suggestions. He didn't take it well. He told me, "I thought you were hiring me to improve things, not to follow rules like a drone." By the end of the day, I made the decision to let him go. It was clear that his attitude and unwillingness to learn were too much of a hindrance. Story 14. I'm the HR manager for a mid-sized company, and we had a new hire start in the finance department. They were highly recommended by a former colleague, which is why I was confident in hiring. However, I quickly realized that my confidence was misplaced. The first day was typical, getting the new hire set up with a laptop, access to systems, and a tour of the office. But as soon as the actual work began, things started to go sideways. We had them reviewing financial statements, something relatively straightforward for someone in their position. However, after an hour, they came to me and said, "I'm not sure why we need to follow all these accounting rules. Can't we just do it my way?" I explained to them that accuracy and adherence to protocol were essential, especially in finance. But instead of taking that seriously, they pushed back harder, suggesting that the rules were outdated and that they had their own way of doing things that would streamline the process. I told them that their methods weren't compatible with our systems, and that part of the job was learning our processes first before suggesting changes. By midday, they were already criticizing our software, the way we handled client reports, and even the team's general work. It became clear they were more interested in arguing than contributing to the team. I sat them down and explained that this wasn't the right environment for someone who wasn't willing to adapt. They argued briefly, but then packed up and left. I had to let them go that same day. Story 15. I was the manager at a retail clothing store, and we had a new sales associate start. This person came highly recommended and was enthusiastic about joining the team. On their first day, they were given the typical training, product knowledge, store layout, and customer service standards. However, as soon as they interacted with customers, I noticed something wasn't quite right. They were ignoring our store's script, offering discounts to customers on their own, and giving product recommendations that didn't align with our inventory or promotions. When I pointed this out, they said, "I just think these things would sell better if people knew how much they could save." I told them to stick to the training guidelines and promotions as set out in the handbook. The response I got was, "I know what people want. I can sell this stuff better than anyone else." That was the moment I knew we had a problem. We don't allow employees to act as if they know more than the system we've set up, especially when they're brand new. After another hour of continued defiance, I let them know that it wasn't working out and that they needed to leave. They tried to argue, but it was clear they weren't interested in learning our way of doing things. They left without a word, and I was relieved the issue was dealt with quick. Story 16. I manage a medium-sized tech support team, and we recently hired a new employee. They seemed to have a lot of experience in customer service, and I was hopeful they'd be a good fit. The first day started off fine. They were polite, seemed eager to get started, and appeared ready to tackle the job. We started with a basic onboarding session, introducing them to our ticketing system, how to manage requests, and what the clients typically needed help with. But after the first few hours, things took an unexpected turn. The first customer call they took was a simple password reset. It should have been straightforward, but they spent over 40 minutes on the phone, asking the client questions that were irrelevant to the issue at hand. When they finally ended the call, I asked what had happened, and they told me, "I just wanted to make sure everything was clear." I reminded them that customer calls are time-sensitive, and the priority is getting issues resolved quick. They didn't seem to take it well. The next few calls were even worse. Confusing troubleshooting steps, telling clients that they'd have to wait for days to get an answer, and just overall a lack of urgency. When I sat down to give them some feedback, they seemed defensive. They kept saying, "I was just trying to be thorough, and this is how I do things." I tried to explain that we operate under different standards, but they just weren't getting it. By the end of the day, I realized they weren't adapting to our fast-paced work environment. I let them go that same evening. Story 17. I'm a project manager at a construction company, and we recently hired a junior architect. From their resume, they seemed like a strong candidate, fresh out of a respected architectural program with several internships under their belt. I expected them to need some mentoring, but I was confident they could handle the basic tasks we'd give them. On their first day, they were assigned to a relatively simple project, reviewing building plans and making minor revisions. However, it quickly became apparent that they weren't paying attention to details. They kept missing obvious discrepancies between the plans and regulations. When I pointed this out, they would just shrug and say, "It's probably fine." By lunch, I had already seen multiple examples of them cutting corners, skipping steps, and ignoring safety standards. I thought maybe they were just nervous or overwhelmed, so I tried to reassure them, telling them it was okay to ask questions. But instead of asking, they started making excuses. "I'm sure I can figure it out myself," they said. I sat them down and explained that this wasn't a position where they could afford to make assumptions or overlook regulations. The work needed to be precise and thorough. Their response? "Well, I don't think this type of architecture is for me. I prefer to work more creatively and intuitive." That was when I realized this wasn't going to work. By the end of the day, I told them it wasn't a good fit, and they left. It was disappointing, but safety and attention to detail are non-negotiable in our industry. Story 18. I run a small nonprofit that works with local communities on environmental initiatives. We had hired a new outreach coordinator, a position that requires someone passionate, organized, and capable of building relationships with local organizations and donors. From the interview, they had all the right qualifications and seemed eager to make a positive impact. However, things took a strange turn on the first day. They spent the entire morning sitting at their desk, not interacting with anyone or asking questions about how the team worked. By noon, they had made zero progress on the tasks I had assigned them. When I asked if they needed any help or clarification, they said, "I'm just figuring things out. I like to work alone." I respected that to a degree, but as the day went on, I realized they weren't actually doing any work. They were just scrolling through social media, responding to personal emails, and not even attempting to get familiar with the task at hand. This went on for hours, and when I asked them again if they needed assistance, they replied, "I work best when I'm left alone to figure things out." By mid-afternoon, I knew it wasn't going to work. I needed someone who could jump in and be part of a team. I had a final conversation with them, explained that their work ethic and approach weren't a good fit for our environment, and let them go that same day. Story 19. I'm a managing director at a finance firm, and we had hired a new analyst to help with financial models. They had just graduated from a top business school, and during the interview, they spoke confidently about their technical skills and passion for finance. On paper, they looked like a dream hire. However, things quickly unraveled. On the first day, I had them start by reviewing some financial reports to ensure they understood the firm's methodologies. The first sign of trouble was when they submitted their first set of revisions. It was clear that they hadn't even understood the fundamentals of the financial model. I gave them some feedback and asked them to try again. They seemed receptive at first, but after I checked in an hour later, they had made little progress. They didn't seem to understand why certain adjustments needed to be made, even though I had explained it to them. It wasn't just that they were struggling with the task. They were also slow to ask for help, instead trying to power through on their own. When I sat down to give more specific guidance, they were defensive. They started saying things like, "I don't need to learn how to do it your way. I've done this before at school." I tried to explain that we had our own standards, and they needed to learn them. But they kept dismissing the feedback, saying things like, "I'll get it on my own eventually." By the end of the day, I knew they weren't going to adapt. I called them in and let them go. It was unfortunate, but we needed someone who could work within our structure. Story 20. I've been managing a chain of retail stores for the past few years, and we had a new store associate start last week. On their first day, everything seemed fine. They were eager to learn, asked the right questions, and even had some retail experience. I expected them to take a little time to get comfortable, but they seemed like they'd settle in quickly. However, the issues started when it came time for them to help customers. We had a rush of people come in during the afternoon, and this new associate immediately froze up. Instead of greeting customers and offering assistance, they stood behind the counter, staring blankly at the customers. When I encouraged them to approach a few people, they muttered, "I don't want to bother them. I'll wait for them to ask for help." This went on for most of the afternoon, and I began to notice that they were constantly distracted, often checking their phone or looking around the store instead of engaging with customers. At one point, I asked them to assist with a product restocking task, and they just shrugged and said, "I'm not in the mood for that today." By the end of the day, I had to sit them down. I explained that retail requires a level of initiative and engagement that they weren't showing. They admitted that they didn't think they were cut out for the position. It was disappointing, but I told them it wasn't going to work, and they left shortly after. Story 21. I'm the office manager for a medium-sized law firm. We hired a new receptionist, and the first day was filled with typical introductions, setting up accounts, and showing them around the office. They seemed eager to get started, and the interview had gone well. Experience in customer service and a calm demeanor. But soon enough, I started noticing some red flags. The first was their response to our phone system training. It wasn't a complex system by any means, and most new hires pick it up quickly. However, this new receptionist kept saying things like, "I don't understand why you have to do it this way. It seems so outdated." At first, I thought they were just confused. But it wasn't just the phone system. This attitude began to creep into other aspects of the job. They had trouble processing simple forms, misdirected calls to the wrong departments, and openly admitted to not reading the office handbook because it was too long. The real breaking point came when a client came in with an urgent document, and the receptionist misfiled it in the wrong cap. When I went to ask them about it, they shrugged and said, "It's fine. I'll fix it later." That kind of nonchalance about such important details didn't sit right with me. After an awkward conversation, it became clear that they weren't interested in following our processes. I decided to let them go by the end of the day. It was an uncomfortable decision, but the firm couldn't afford that level of carelessness. Story 22. I manage a tech company's content team, and we recently hired a new writer. On paper, they had everything going for them: great credentials, a solid portfolio, and a passion for technology. I was confident they'd be a good fit for our startup environment, which can sometimes be chaotic, but is rewarding for those who can adapt. On their first day, they seemed eager to impress, asking a lot of questions and getting to work immediately. I assigned them to write a blog post about a new software feature we had just released. However, what followed was perplexing. They delivered the draft at the end of the day, but it was riddled with inaccuracies. The technical descriptions were wrong, the tone wasn't consistent with the company's voice, and the overall structure was poor. When I pointed out the issues, they didn't seem receptive. Instead of acknowledging the mistakes, they replied, "I don't understand why you're being so critical. I've written for much larger companies than this." That comment raised a red flag for me, but I let them revise it. By the time they submitted their revision, they'd made very few changes. I decided to have a sit down and let them know it wasn't working out. They were very resistant to feedback, and when I mentioned that we needed someone who could learn and adapt, they said, "I don't think this is the kind of writing I want to do." It was a tough call, but by the end of the day, I had to let them go. Sometimes people just aren't open to the kind of growth a company requires. Story 23. I run a small family-owned restaurant, and we were thrilled to hire a new line cook. They came highly recommended, with years of experience in fine dining kitchens. We were a little more laid back compared to the high-end places they'd worked at, but I figured they could adjust. The first day started well enough. They moved quickly and seemed to have a good grasp on the kitchen's layout. But the issues started when I gave them a simple prep task. I asked them to chop vegetables for the day's menu, which was something everyone in the kitchen does, no matter their position. They grumbled about it, muttering under their breath, "This is beneath me." I figured maybe they were just having an off moment, so I let it slide. As the day went on, it became clear that this wasn't just a bad attitude, it was a pattern. They started giving unsolicited advice to other cooks on the line, criticizing the way they were preparing certain dishes. When I stepped in to give some feedback on their approach to prepping, they got defensive and said, "I know how to do this better than you. Trust me." By the afternoon, it was obvious that they weren't willing to work within the team dynamic. I needed someone who could be flexible and humble enough to fit into the fast-paced, team-oriented environment we have. I had a conversation with them and let them go before the end of their first shift. I wish it had worked out, but it wasn't the right fit. Story 24. I work as a senior manager at a marketing firm, and we recently hired a project coordinator who was supposed to help streamline communication between our teams. The first day went relatively smoothly, with the usual orientation and getting them set up in our project management software. But when it came time to actually coordinate the first client project they were assigned to, things started to unravel. The first issue was that they missed a crucial client meeting without notifying anyone. When I checked in on them, they said, "I didn't think it was that important." The next issue came when they were supposed to compile a progress report for the client. They sent out a report that was filled with errors, including incorrect timelines and missing deliverables. When I asked them to correct the mistakes, their response was, "This is how I've always done it in my previous jobs. I'm sure they won't mind." That was a big red flag. We pride ourselves on being detail-oriented, and that kind of lack of accountability was concerning. I spent some time with them to explain why we have strict standards, but the more we spoke, the more it seemed clear they weren't willing to learn or adapt to our processes. At the end of the day, I sat them down and explained that this position required a higher level of responsibility than they were prepared to take on. They seemed taken aback but left without any further issues. It was a disappointing outcome, but I couldn't risk compromising our client relationships. Story 25. I manage a fitness center, and we had a new personal trainer start last week. On their first day, they were confident, professional, and appeared to have a solid background in training clients. I was hopeful, as we've been growing quickly and need strong, reliable trainers to keep up with demand. But things went wrong during their first training session with a client. The client had specified a need for a rehabilitation plan due to a knee injury, but the trainer didn't seem to take it seriously. They started pushing the client to do heavy leg exercises, which directly contradicted the advice given by the client's doctor. When I intervened and pointed out the need for a gentler approach, the trainer brushed me off, saying, "I've been in this field for years. I know what works." I let them continue with the session, but as I watched, it became clear they weren't following proper procedures. By the end of the session, the client was in discomfort, and I was concerned that the trainer hadn't been paying attention to the client's limitations. After the session, I had a serious conversation with the trainer. They were very resistant to feedback and even said, "I know how to do this job. I don't need to change my methods." I knew then that their approach wasn't going to align with our standards of care. I let them go before the end of the day. It was unfortunate, but patient safety had to come first. Story 26. I manage a growing software company, and we had just hired a new junior developer. The first day went smooth. He was punctual, seemed eager, and had a good grasp of the basic coding languages we use. He sat down at his desk, got set up with his workstation, and immediately started exploring the codebase. A few hours in, I assigned him his first task, a small bug fix in a feature we were about to release. The task was straightforward, and we expected it to take a couple of hours. I checked in with him halfway through and he assured me everything was going well. But when I reviewed the code he had written, I noticed multiple glaring issues. He had missed several key steps, and there were several instances where his code didn't align with our project's best practices. I approached him with my concerns, and his response was, "It should work, though. I've done similar things before, and this is how I usually do it." I explained that we needed to follow a specific structure and method, especially with high-visibility projects, but he seemed unwilling to adapt. Instead of fixing the mistakes, he pushed back even harder, claiming that our way was too complicated and not efficient. That was the moment I realized that this wouldn't be a good fit. I needed someone who could follow guidelines and work within our system. After a quick chat, I made the decision to let him go that same day. Story 27. I'm a restaurant manager, and we recently hired a new waiter. The interview had gone well. He was personable, had prior experience, and seemed like he'd fit into our team. The first shift started off fine, but things quickly took a turn for the worse. When the restaurant started to fill up, I noticed the new waiter seemed to be getting more and more flustered. He was moving slowly between tables and constantly asked other waiters for help with basic tasks, like refilling drinks or bringing out food. When I asked if he was okay, he told me, "I'm just taking my time to make sure everything is perfect." I didn't want to micromanage, so I let him go about his work, but it quickly became evident that his idea of perfect was extremely slow and inefficient. The real turning point came when he had a table of 6 people, and he forgot to bring out half of their order. When they pointed this out, he simply apologized, saying, "I'm only human," and did nothing to rectify the situation for 15 minutes. I pulled him aside after the shift and explained that the pace he was working at wasn't going to work for us. He said, "I think I work better under less pressure." But the reality was that working in a restaurant is all about handling pressure and multitasking. By the end of the day, I had to let him go. Story 28. I work as the head of HR at a tech company, and we had recently hired a new marketing coordinator. Her resume was strong. She had great experience, and her enthusiasm during the interview was contagious. The first day was a mix of onboarding and introductions, and everything seemed to be going smooth. However, as the day progressed, I began to notice that she wasn't following the usual procedures we had in place. She was supposed to work on drafting some initial marketing emails for a campaign we were launching, but when I checked on her progress, she was still stuck on the brainstorming phase. "Why are you still brainstorming?" I asked. Her response was that she was waiting for the perfect idea to come to her. When I explained that in our fast-paced environment, we had to act quickly and that perfection wasn't always possible, she seemed visibly frustrated. She mentioned that her previous job let her take more time to perfect things. I tried to explain that we needed things done quickly and efficiently, but the more I spoke with her, the more I realized that her work style was in complete contrast to our culture. She wasn't willing to adjust to the fast pace and instead kept insisting on waiting for inspiration. I had a conversation with her at the end of the day, explaining that we needed someone who could balance creativity with practicality. She didn't seem open to feedback and left by the end of her shift. Story 29. I manage a small accounting firm, and we hired a new accountant to join our team. She had several years of experience, so I was optimistic about her skills. However, things didn't go as expected. On her first day, I assigned her a basic task, reconciling some accounts for a client. The task was straightforward, and she should have been able to complete it without issue. But hours passed and she hadn't made much progress. When I checked in with her, I was surprised to find that she had made multiple errors in the calculations, including missing key expenses and misreporting income. I pointed out the mistakes and asked if she needed any help, but her response was, "I know what I'm doing. I've done this 100 times before." The errors kept piling up. By the end of the day, the accounts she had worked on were in complete disarray. I was starting to feel concerned when she casually said, "It's fine. I'll fix it later." I knew then that she wasn't the right fit for the job. We needed someone who was meticulous and detail-oriented, especially with financial matters. I spoke with her that evening and explained that her work wasn't up to our standards. She seemed surprised, but I had to let her go by the end of the shift. Story 30. I work as a creative director at a design agency, and we recently hired a new graphic designer. The first day started off great. Their portfolio was solid, and they seemed to fit in with the team. However, after a couple of hours, I began to notice a disturbing trend. We were working on a project for a new client, and I had given them some initial design briefs to follow. But when I reviewed the drafts, they were completely off-mark. The colors didn't match the branding guidelines, and the layout was messy. I tried to give them specific feedback, but every time I mentioned a change, they shrugged it off. "Isn't it better this way?" they asked, as if the client's preferences didn't matter. I think it's more creative. I explained that while creativity is important, it also needed to align with the client's needs and brand. They didn't seem to take the feedback seriously. By the end of the day, I had to ask them to leave. They weren't able to take constructive criticism, and without that quality, there's no way they could succeed in our environment. Story 31. I manage a team of customer service representatives at an e-commerce company. One of the new hires started with a lot of enthusiasm. She seemed passionate about helping people and had experience in customer service. However, things quickly started to go wrong on her first day. Her training was going fine at first. She grasped the system quickly and I was hopeful. However, when it came time for her to take her first live call, everything changed. The call started off with a basic issue. A customer wanted to return an item, which was well within our return policy. Instead of following the usual script, she started to get defensive. The customer politely asked about the policy, and she responded, "I don't know why you're complaining about this. It's just a simple return." I could hear the customer's frustration building as she raised her voice, and our new hire was completely unfazed, offering no apology. When I intervened to offer help, she shot me a look, clearly irritated, and said, "I'm handling it, don't worry." But it was clear she was not handling it well at all. After the call, I pulled her aside to discuss what happened. Her response was dismissive. "I don't see why customers get so upset over small things." I explained that in customer service, it's important to stay calm, be empathetic, and stick to the policy without getting personal. She seemed to brush it off, saying that she'd deal with it her way. By the end of the day, I had made the decision to let her go. We needed someone who could handle tough situations with empathy and professionalism, and she wasn't willing to adjust to our approach. Story 32. As a small business owner, I recently hired a new warehouse assistant to help us with inventory and shipping. On his first day, he was eager, had a great attitude, and seemed to have a strong work ethic, which was exactly what I needed. I assigned him the task of organizing a shipment that had just arrived. It seemed simple enough. Check off the inventory, organize items by category, and prepare them for distribution. However, an hour into the task, I noticed that he wasn't following any of the instructions I'd given. Instead of checking the items against the list, he was just stacking boxes wherever he found space, mixing different categories of products together. I stopped by to ask if he needed help, and his response was, "I thought it would be faster if I just started moving stuff around. It'll get done quicker this way." I explained that our system was set up for a reason, that organization was key for efficiency, especially when fulfilling orders for customers. He shrugged and said, "I work better on my own. I don't need a system to get things done." The situation escalated when I checked in on his progress and found that he had placed fragile items on top of heavy boxes. The potential for damage was huge. I asked him again to follow the system, but he ignored me, saying, "I'll fix it later when I see fit." At that point, I realized his approach would create chaos, and I needed someone who could follow directions and maintain our standards. I sat down with him and explained that this wasn't a good fit. He left at the end of the day, and I immediately started searching for a replacement. Story 33. I run a marketing agency, and we had hired a new graphic designer to help us with upcoming campaigns. On their first day, they were excited to dive into some of the creative briefs we had lined up. We were working on a branding project for a new client, and had given clear instructions on the style, color scheme, and target audience. However, when the designer submitted their first draft, it was completely different from what we had asked. The colors were wrong, the fonts didn't match our brand guidelines, and the overall style was completely off. When I asked for clarification, they said, "I thought it would look better this way. I want to bring a fresh perspective." I explained to them that fresh perspectives are great, but we had already agreed on a specific direction with the client, and it was essential to stick to the brief. I provided some constructive feedback and asked them to revise it. A few hours later, the revised design came back, and it was still a significant departure from the guideline. This time, I was concerned. This was a project for a high-profile client, and the designer was not respecting our agreed-upon vision. I sat down with them, and they told me, "I'm not used to having my creativity boxed in. I think I work better when I'm free to do what I want." At that point, it became clear that they wouldn't be able to work within the structure we required. I had a difficult conversation with them, explaining that we needed someone who could follow guidelines and work with the team, not just on their own ideas. By the end of the day, I had to let them go. Story 34. I'm the general manager of a large hotel, and we recently hired a front desk agent to handle check-ins and guest inquiries. From their resume, I could tell they had a lot of experience in the hospitality industry, and I was eager to have them on board. However, things took a turn almost immediately. The first few hours were fine, showing them around the hotel, getting them familiar with our systems, and explaining the layout of the building. But when it came time for them to check in guests, they began making errors. Guests had been waiting in line, and the new hire was struggling with the computer system. They accidentally overcharged a guest and failed to apologize when the guest pointed it out. When I took over to help them, they became defensive and said, "I'm just getting the hang of it." However, the mistakes kept happening. They also became frustrated when guests asked for special accommodations, saying things like, "You should have told me about that in advance." It was clear that they weren't handling the stress of the job well. When I asked them how they were feeling, they said, "I'm just not used to being this busy. I thought it would be more relaxed." I realized that this role required someone who could handle stress and manage multiple tasks at once, and they weren't ready for that. By the end of the shift, I knew I had to let them go. Story 35. I'm the creative director of a design studio, and we recently hired a new copywriter. Their portfolio looked strong, and during the interview, they seemed confident and capable. We assigned them their first project, writing copy for a new website that we were launching for a major client. Unfortunately, the first draft came back riddled with errors. The tone didn't match the client's brand at all, and the language felt disjointed. When I gave feedback, they responded with, "I thought this sounded more engaging." The client will appreciate it. I reiterated that the writing needed to follow the specific tone we had developed with the client, but they insisted that their approach was better. I asked for revisions, and when they came back, the mistakes were still there. It became clear that they were not willing to adjust their style to meet the client's needs. When I tried to explain that being adaptable is crucial in this industry, they said, "I don't believe in just writing what clients want. I want to write what I think works." By the end of the day, I knew this wasn't going to work out. Creative freedom is important, but it needs to be balanced with the client's needs. I had to let them go, but it was a difficult decision.